Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. In my last video, I talked about the difference between a traditional hero's story and a feminist hero's story. And I used as my example of the feminist hero story, the Captain Marvel movie. And I went over the mindset of the feminist writers and creators of this story, and then talked about how they express those ideas in the story. But today I want to talk about how that kind of mindset, that exact feminist mindset, actually affects the creation of comics and these kinds of stories to begin with. And if you didn't listen to that other video, I'll put the link in the description so that if you want to stop now and go listen to it, you can. But I'll also link it at the end if you want to go watch it at the end as well. But the very bare bones of my argument was that in your feminist mindset, there is two kinds of power. They believe that there is male power and there is female power. And male power has the earmarks of being destructive and domineering, whereas female power has the earmarks of being cooperative and creative. And in their minds, what they believe that they need to do is get rid of all of that male power, which they call the patriarchy, and just have the female power, because the male power is all negative and the female power is all positive. So they want to concentrate on that female power. And in doing so, they get rid of little things like objective truth, because objective truth is domineering, because it actually tells you, no, look, this is the way things are, whether you know it, like it, or believe it. Whereas in their cooperative mindset, they believe that the only things that should be true are the things that you actually feel are true, which is subjective truth. So their hero wants to get to an endpoint of believing so much in themselves that they can do anything. That is to say, they believe so much in themselves that they have rejected all of that male power and accepted all of that female power so absolutely that they can define what reality is itself according to how they feel. And that's the end point of their feminist hero's journey. But this also drastically affects the way that they create these stories as well. Especially, you can see it now in the way that the comic industry is actually set out. So what got me thinking about all this to begin with was another Women of Marvel podcast where you had Sana Amanat and Judy Stevens, who are the two women who run the podcast. They were interviewing a lot of people concerning the creation of the Captain Marvel movie. They were on the red carpet interviewing people. They were in the studio talking to Brie Larson, talking to Samuel L. Jackson, talking to the two directors of the movie itself. And there's a short quote from the interview with the two directors of the movie that I think actually encapsulates exactly what I was talking about in that last video and what I want to talk about in this video. So you have Judy Stevens, who is one of the interviewers for the Women of Marvel, and she asks this question. She says, "I think this is a good story. It's about tackling self-doubt and believing in yourself. I think that's the thing many people struggle with. And you see Carol throughout the film deal with that and eventually come to figure it all out. How was it building that and getting people to get that confidence is a thing and that you can get to it eventually?" So we have Ryan Fleck, one of the directors of the movie, saying, "Of course, that's a big deal. This is a story about Carol who goes on a journey of self-discovery, and she learns about her past, and she learns who she is, and I think it's not just overcoming that self-doubt, because I think a little amount of self-doubt is a healthy thing, and that it allows us to question our world. It allows us to question our role in it. So I don't think that by the end of the movie, she hasn't figured everything out. She's figured out her past, and I think she's owned that confidence of who she is. But I think she'll go forward in life now being able to question her role in the world and the universe in a very healthy way." And right after he says that, you have Anna Boden, who is the other director of this movie, contradicting him just a little bit, contradicting him and his male perspective of what this movie is supposed to be about. She says, "And part of when we talk about overcoming self-doubt, or at least like getting the confidence to deal with your own self-doubt and accept it, a lot of that in the film is about, and I think in our lives is, I think a lot of people can relate to, is kind of being able to reject those negative voices. The voices of people who are telling you that you should be someone who you aren't naturally, or you have to be a certain way in order to be successful." All right, so you have within the question itself an assumption that this story is about getting rid of self-doubt and believing in yourself. And both of the directors of this film actually quite agree with this. Agree with it in a little bit of a different way. Ryan Fleck actually believes that you need to have a little bit of self-doubt, whereas you have Anna Boden saying, no, you got to get rid of all of those negative voices. You have to be able to believe in yourself so much that you can even get rid of all of those negative voices. Now, something I want to point out very quickly here is that you have your far leftists, and I would say that includes these three who are talking. You have your far leftists. They talk about confidence, but they don't actually mean confidence, because they're always talking about here in this interview getting rid of self-doubt and being confident. But they don't actually mean confidence. What they mean is self-esteem. Now, if you're older than 30 years old, you probably went through school with people telling you that you should have self-confidence. But that's not what they teach today and haven't taught that for a little while. What they talk about now is having self-esteem. And the two are massively different. And what these people here are talking about, they're talking about self-esteem, not about confidence, although they use the word confidence. Because how do you gain confidence? Well, you gain confidence through practical experience. You know, if you're a student and you want to do well in a test, how do you become confident that you're going to do well in the test? Well, you study for the test. If you're part of a sports team and you want to do well when the game comes along, what do? Well, you practice, and make sure that when the time comes for the game, that you are confident in your ability to actually do what needs to be done. And so on and so forth. So you gain confidence through practical experience. But what is self-esteem? Because these people are talking about self-esteem. Well, esteem is thinking highly of someone else. And so what is self-esteem? Well, self-esteem is thinking highly of yourself. And what kids are taught today is that they should have self-esteem. No matter who they are, no matter what they are, they should have self-esteem. It's not the old way in which you gain confidence through experience. No, they're told that you should have self-esteem just because. You should have self-esteem because of who you are, which is something that Anna Boden says right here. You know, you should be who you naturally are. You don't have to be how other people say that you should be, even if they say this is how you're to be successful. No, you don't have to listen to that. You just have to be who you are and be comfortable with who you are. So that's talking about self-esteem. And that's the whole nub of the problem with the creation of comics today, and with your feminist ideology that's sitting at the heart of a lot of how they create comics today. Because, of course, you have these people, and they're always talking about comic creating as being a community. They never talk about it as it being an industry, because an industry, of course, is very competitive. Competitive in a way of that male power, you know, that domineering and destructive power. They don't want any of that. They want there to be female power. They want it to be cooperative and creative. And last year they talked about this in the Women of Marvel podcast itself, the difference between being creative and destructive. So they're always pushing for comic creating to be part of a community where everything is cooperative. Again, going back to that female idea of power, being cooperative. All of these comic pros are always talking about the fact that comic creating is a community. And you have Sana Amanat here as part of the Women of Marvel podcast. She's the second in command at Marvel Comics, and she has put a theme on the entire year of the podcast for the Women of Marvel about building communities. That's what the theme for the entire year is. And again, she's the second in command at Marvel Comics. So here's the thing. What does this community look like? Well, this community is a community that is a closed community. And we have a little hint of it here where you have Anna Boden talking about the rejection of negative voices. So they close off their community to all forms of criticism. And there were at least 2 podcasts from the Women of Marvel last year. One was actually from the San Diego Comic-Con where they had a panel and they talked specifically about this exact thing, that in the comic community, they need to block out all negative voices. Quite specifically, they had a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of women on this panel talking about how they had to block people out of their social media and make sure that they never allow these negative voices to get in. So the community automatically separates the people inside from the people outside, and quite specifically does so in order to eliminate any kind of criticism from the outside. So if they're eliminating any kind of criticism from the outside, what does the inside of the community look like? Well, the inside of the community looks like affirmation that leads to self-affirmation. All you have are these comic pros, and they pat each other on the back for how well that they are doing, no matter whether or not they're actually doing well on sales, no matter whether or not their comics are actually being canceled. It doesn't matter, because of course all of those things, like sales numbers, well, they are objective truth things. You can point to them and say, look, the numbers don't lie. It's objectively telling you that you have a bad book because it's not selling. It's been canceled 4 times. Therefore, objectively, this looks like something you should not be doing. But of course, that's why you have people like Sana Amanat saying things like, well, you can't just look at the numbers. That doesn't tell you anything. So what they do in their little closed community is shut off not only any criticism, but again, anything that is going to objectively show them that they are actually moving in the wrong direction, like the numbers of their sales. And again, if you want to go back to what I was saying in my last video, where you have their heroes endpoint is to believe so much in themselves that they can, quote unquote, do anything. That is to say, they can actually define what reality is for them according to their own subjective truths. That's the endpoint of their feminist hero's journey. But it's a little easier in a make-believe world to get to that point. But in the actual real world, they want to do the exact same thing. They need to make sure that they shut out all of these toxic, male, negative voices, and they do so by making this community that's closed off, where there's only affirmation, where you have everybody simply patting each other on the back. And the whole point of doing this is to make sure, as they say in that exact little excerpt that I read a few minutes ago, that they want to get rid of all self-doubt. And by the way, in that podcast itself, they talk over and over again. They ask this question over and over again, saying this story is about getting rid of self-doubt. So that's what they do within their own little community. You have a community of individuals, and they affirm each other over and over again so that those individuals can eventually get to the point of self-affirmation, where they can just affirm themselves no matter what is going on outside. And again, you can see this reflected in their stories, because their stories like The Champions and Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel, or The Unstoppable Wasp, it's all just a big hug fest. Their stories just have the supporting characters just affirming the main character, and then you have the main character affirming themselves, because again, that is their end point of their hero, self-affirmation to the point where they think they can define what reality is. So briefly, to recap, what do you have in the comic industry today? Well, it's not an industry at all. It's a quote-unquote community, a self-proclaimed community that is a closed community of individuals that make sure that they shut out any kind of negative voices, shut out any kind of criticism, even if it's objective fact as to their sales numbers. And within the community itself, there's simply affirmation that leads to self-affirmation. And so you have people writing stories based upon this feminist ideal of being cooperative and creative and blocking out any of those male traits that they think are purely negative. And these would include things like conflict. But of course, they're writing superhero comics. And to write superhero comics that have no conflict and is simply about self-affirmation all of the time, they either have to do one of two things. They have to eliminate conflict altogether, or they have to make sure that the agenda is clearly written into the comic so that it shows that the conflict is obviously against the male domineering patriarchal power that they're trying to destroy. And this is, of course, just another one of the reasons why, in this time of almost unprecedented economic growth everywhere, you have a comic industry that is dying. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.